Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast. My name is Paul Ellis, and I'm your host for these programs about developments in this fast-growing industry. Today's Sustainable Finance Podcast guest believes that in the future, energy will be clean, resilient, abundant, and free. Harnessing that energy will allow us to preserve wild places and protect the magic of our natural world, while propelling us to the far reaches of our solar system and beyond. Nick Davis, CEO at GridMarket, believes that we all have a role to play in the giant leaps that AI and energy abundance will produce for humanity. Nick also believes that harnessing the power of GridMarket's subscription service in partnership with companies like GRP Wegmanm will redefine clean energy projects, embracing state-of-the-art technology and artificial intelligence to pinpoint, optimize, and execute renewable energy solutions with unmatched precision. Hello, Nick, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We're really glad you could join us today. I'm excited to learn more about GridMarket, so let's jump right into the questions that we have for you. We'll start with asking you, how have you seen financiers, developers, and energy procurement and construction firms work to meet the financial needs of customers when finalizing clean energy projects?
Thanks for that question, Paul. And simply put, they haven't met those needs. And I think a characteristic that I think many of us have seen of the financial community in general is that what they're really good at is solving problems for themselves. What that doesn't necessarily mean is doing what's best always for, of course, the natural world, but we'll table that for a second. But at minimum, the customer. Customers have a lot of flexible requirements. They have a lot of kind of different needs that have to be served. And what the finance community has done, particularly in the clean energy space, and particularly in the project and infrastructure finance space, is create very narrow buckets and very narrow buy boxes, which of course makes the customer have many different counterparties rather than single sources of truth. And I think we'll get to a little more around that later. But long story short, we've definitely fallen short of what the customers need in order to scale and deliver in the time horizons required to both meet their own internal objectives and, most importantly, accelerate all of these installations, decarbonization, and new energy transitions to actually help the world. But I think there are solutions, and hopefully we get into some of them.
Great. Now, you've just used a term which I'm not familiar with, Nick, and I would imagine a lot of our followers aren't either, and that is buy box. Could you explain for us what that means?
Yeah, and this is a jargon-filled industry, of course. So please, anytime any acronyms or terms come up, I'm always happy to describe further.
Sure.
But in terms of buy box, what I really mean by that is, what's very common and what people want, particularly on the investment side now, is cookie cutter, highly repeatable deals. What that means is effectively turning what's inherently complex into commodities so they don't have to think about it. And the 1,000th deal you do looks exactly the same as number 2 and number 3.
Okay.
That's how you get rid of soft costs. It's how your margins go up ultimately. And it's how automation, and when I say automation, what I mean is pre-AI automation, which requires kind of more standardized same task processing, like a Ford assembly line. That's the automation of days past. Now we're in a sophisticated automation zone where AI can actually address complex problems, meaning the financial community and others really need to start thinking about these challenges as inherently solvable with the technologies of the day that allow you to expand that buy box. And just very narrowly, a buy box is what an investor, what a customer, what anyone is willing to buy. And typically investors want something very narrow and very repeatable. And what a customer wants is something very flexible and tailored to them.
Yeah, it's sort of opposite ends of the spectrum, right? So
Yes.
To address those kinds of issues in the marketplace, how do companies like GridMarket and GRP Wegmanm partner to accelerate the development of clean energy projects?
Yeah, so there are customers out there and there are vendors out there that build, construct, fund projects, and then there are platforms that can help optimize both the development, the scoping, the analytics, and ultimately automate some of those deployment elements that are typically analytically intensive and often will result in a project not being as big or optimal or proliferated across a company's, 10 or 10,000 facilities as it otherwise would be if it was looked at in a more intelligent way. That means less business for everyone. It means a smaller market. It means these big customers that have large ESG goals. It means they all fall woefully behind their objectives. Then they have to go to their board and let their board know that they've fallen behind their objectives. Then the market finds out that they've fallen behind their goals and objectives, and they can have supply chain consequences. They can have direct customer consequences, depending on whether they're a B2B business or a B2C business. But fundamentally, what we're doing and where we're leveraging data and artificial intelligence is trying to make those complex decisions look more cookie cutter. So we're basically serving a customer's goal across an entire portfolio with a variety of needs, a variety of technologies in a more agnostic way, and an opportunity to really coalesce intelligent financing across those needs rather than, again, having a limited buy box with very limited results.
Okay, so it sounds like at the moment there's a what I would call a domino effect in the procurement process of clean energy projects that creates this system the way it is. Now, what would you say is missing from the current financing options offered for individual projects and or portfolio clean energy projects?
Yeah, and when you look, just so the audience kind of has a concrete example of the way we see the market.
Sure.
If you look at a customer, so one of our biggest customers is a large manufacturer. So in addition to call it 20 to 30 large industrial facilities where materials are produced, or the distribution centers where things are stored and then go out to their various retail centers, this isn't dissimilar across a number of different customers who have different operations. So they may have industrial facilities, they may have data centers, they may have certain types of commercial or logistics centers, and then they'll have office buildings. What typically happens in this space is a solution provider, like a provider of solar or EV charging or fuel cells or energy efficiency or HVAC optimization and climate control mechanisms, they'll knock on the customer's door and say, hey, we've got a great incentive in California. Let's do a project here where it's highly incentivized. So what happens is the customer goes piecemeal, one by one, getting pitched by thousands of vendors and solution providers, ultimately spending years to vet things on a one-off project by project basis. Maybe they spend some capital budget on a pilot that takes years to validate. And ultimately what happens is very little gets done. And people throw their hands up in the air and kind of give up. What we really need to move towards, because we're out of pilot phase for most of these technologies now, what we really need to move towards is economies of scale-based procurement, where we are very quickly rooting out the full opportunity in a portfolio, or we do work with entire countries in certain cases, or map out the opportunity across an entire municipality or country or territory, and really bind the full purchasing power of an entire company's portfolio and their real estate assets together to, again, drive economies of scale-based procurement, and look at this at kind of a macro level, because they're setting their targets on a macro level, but then procuring on a very micro level in a mind-numbing process. And when I talk about the financial buy boxes and the solution provider buy boxes being too small, what that means is there's one type of developer or one type of solution provider or solar installer, for instance, in one part of the country that wants to do one size project. They want to do maybe a 200 kilowatt project plus a small battery on a handful of those 3,500 retail facilities where you get your brakes and tires changed. That same company is never doing the industrial facility as well. And the financier who's also trying to package together those smaller deals is never also offering a customer service where they're providing financing for both opportunities. So when you look at the customer base here and they need to do, 100 megawatts of solar in the desert for a larger, offsite procurement under a VPPA or a standard retail agreement, or whether they need to do a mini grid at one of these smaller facilities, or whether they need to do a true microgrid at a big industrial facility. There's no financing solution that's serving all of those entities and looking at the customer as really the customer. They're looking at their vendors and solution providers that are piecemeal servicing a small subset of each of these customers and each of these customers' sites as the customer. And I think really the mentality switch that needs to happen is the finance community needs to catch up and look at the end use energy user who's making these big commitments and targets as the actual customer for financing here, and not limit it just to these vendors and solution providers and installers who have a much more limited and narrow view of how they install and where they should install. We need to change the scope for the financing community, simply put, as to who the customer is.
Okay, now give our followers a couple of examples, no names needed, of projects that have chosen financing options, and talk about what value or benefits made those customers choose that path for their projects.
Yeah, so if you look at how many of these sustainability and renewable energy commitments work for these companies, effectively, when they make an announcement that they have to be 100% renewable energy by 2025 or 2030, what they're typically doing is creating a $300 or $400 million problem. For us, it's a great opportunity, but for them, the problem that they have to solve is, how am I going to fund all this work? How am I going to switch all of our procured power off of standard grid power? How am I going to maximize the number of microgrids that we're putting together across our industrial facility while off-taking large projects and large solar and wind projects from elsewhere? How are we going to change our industrial operations to meet the energy transition? So what these companies never have is the $300, $400, $500 million earmarked and set aside to actually self-invest in these energy projects. What they need to do is go out and secure third-party, typically off-balance sheet funding to do it. That's typically done through mechanisms called power purchase agreements, PPAs, which are kind of larger installations that are off-site, REC procurements in certain cases where you're buying renewable energy credits. And in certain more innovative cases, energy service agreements and shared savings agreements, where maybe it's a different kind of more innovative technology that they don't want to take a risk on, but they want to host. So when they create that level of financial commitment on the back of these renewable energy and carbon commitments, they typically only have maybe a couple $1,000,000 a year that they're going to spend on pilot projects through their sustainability or engineering teams. So what they'll typically do is, the first time they do a solar project, for instance, they'll dip into that CapEx budget. But then what happens to the rest of the requirement? How are they going to get the rest of the $400 million in order to meet this transition? And they're going to do it off balance sheet. They're going to do it under these PPA style structures. It's really the only way they can. So at least right now, right? When we get to the world where energy is, abundant, clean, and free, that's a different story. But we've got a little while to go before that happens. But when we look at where the market is now, because the buy boxes are narrow from the financial and technology community, and because the customers have such a large demand and a diverse demand, you end up with Frankenstein projects when you use multiple technologies. And an example of that is one of our first projects was an amazing project out in Brownsville, Brooklyn, called Marcus Garvey Village, where we took 6 city blocks almost entirely off grid with a partner called L&M. That's the real estate developer. Everything was financed completely separately. The solar was financed by its own mechanism. The fuel cell funding was brought by Bloom, the big fuel cell company, under its own power purchase agreement structure. And then the battery, which was the first lithium-ion battery, permitted by the FDNY in the New York area, that was ultimately funded under a shared savings and energy services agreement by Demand Energy, a local New York-based nonprofit assisted with the financing as well, and Enel ultimately, or Demand Energy ultimately became Enel. But that's 3 technologies, 3 financing mechanisms, and a very under-optimized installation. Cool, of course, but very under-optimized. In contrast, now, years later, the market's caught up, and at least a number of technologies are being amortized together. So we have customers like Performance Food Group, which is a Fortune 100 logistics provider with a lot of facilities and a lot of need, and is currently going through the electric vehicle transition. Now we have situations where they can procure and contract power purchase agreements for solar and battery storage together, and bolting on EV charging and other ancillary services that all really kind of make this more seamless. So things are getting better in terms of the technologies that can be stacked into one financing mechanism. We haven't solved for the size of systems that can also be bolted together to service a customer need, because these customers all have facilities of varying sizes.
Okay, now on to the most popular subject I've seen in the sustainable finance literature and daily dialogue and events and conferences, etc., and that's artificial intelligence. How is AI supporting digital exchange and big data analytics platforms in the renewable energy industry?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, AI allows you to do a lot more with your data and your assets than we were able to do before. It makes complex analysis more simple. And we've been in the AI game for a long time, but before it was AI, it was machine learning, right? And then it evolves into something that's more actionable. And I think at the end of the day, this is all about automating the decision-making process so it can make the free flow of capital safer. So you can evaluate, again, in this industry, what we look at is evaluating projects on a more certain basis, creating enough scenarios in the background to understand, all the downside risk associated with a project or a type of technology, to be able to then manage those technologies in as optimal a way as possible based on both predicted and live weather patterns, making sure that SCADA systems and everything in the grid is really put on an automated track. These are really the perfect things that AI can do. I know it's all the rage to have Chat GPT try to write a song or the next great American novel, and whether it supplants human creativity with that kind of stuff remains to be seen. Some of it's pretty impressive, but what it can absolutely do a lot better than we can now is manage, massage, curate, and act on energy-related data items. That's something that 1,000 humans can't replicate.
All right. Well, you've mentioned one area that I'm very familiar with, being from southern Louisiana, and that's weather. Now, I know that there are lots of firms out there, and some that we've had as guests on the Sustainable Finance podcast, like Weather TradeNet, that are producing, using AI, all of this data that firms like yours can then use and plug into your process, if I understand what you're saying correctly. Is that part of the process for you, something like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you look at the work we do, what we don't want to do is be the absolute best, LiDAR analytics provider for solar, or the best AI weather predictor to manage assets. Those are specialty products that really help us do what we do. What we have to do is aggregate all of those learnings and a lot of those feeds and streams. In some cases, we API it into our system, but really our goal is to compress the transaction cycle and bind as many of these types of deals across as many customers as possible to reach economies of scale and make all of these projects and services inherently financeable so they get done for our customers. So those tools are instrumental for us as we look to really continue to automate, optimize, and make perfect what we do. You see more of those types of tools that focus on different aspects of project work come out pretty much almost every day now, right? That there's a lot of optimization going on in AI applications to accelerate the permitting and interconnection and environmental analysis process before you install, a wind farm or a solar field, for instance. And I think what's critical is that all of these things happen as quickly as possible, because, for a long time in the US, we were in efficiency and megawatt territory where our demand was actually coming down relative to our the number of users and the people and people drawing on that power. But now AI itself has such a hulking power demand that we're going to be falling woefully short, and we have to really install and develop as much as we can as quickly as possible. What's unfortunate is that that's still not resulting in the kinds of grid level investments that would be required to maintain the standard transmission and distribution networks that we have, which means these big data centers, these big industrial facilities, these big cold storage warehouses and logistics centers, universities, everyone's going to have to ultimately be a generator of their own power, at minimum, to be a backstop for the grid that's certainly aging out. So we can spend trillions to update conventional infrastructure. We're probably going to need to anyway, but we also have to start generating at the point source, which is where technologies like ours really come in handy. And AI is really necessary to evaluate and predict the veracity of that opportunity.
Nick, thanks so much for joining us today. I feel like I know a lot more about this process now than before we started our conversation, and I'm sure our followers will tune in carefully. And we look forward to bringing you back to join us again in the future when there's more to report. But for the moment, where online can followers of the Sustainable Finance podcast learn more about the ways GridMarket is accelerating the pace of change in renewable energy project development, and how can they get in touch with you about the topics that we've discussed in today's episode?
Yeah, I'm accessible to be emailed anytime. It's nick.davis@gridmarket.com and ick.davis@gridmarket.com. And we've got great people managing our socials, so you can find us on LinkedIn and all of the other, standard non-TikTok related things out there.
Okay. And by the way, if you have reports or annual surveys or anything that would be helpful to our followers to read and do their own research, you can send us links for those and we'll attach them to this program in the Bright Talk channel. But for the moment, thanks again very much to Nick Davis, CEO at GridMarket, for joining me in today's episode. I'm your host, Paul Ellis, and I invite our followers to join us again next week for another Sustainable Finance podcast.